Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University and also the Professor of Cultural Studies. And in the podcast this week, I wanted to share, nay, overshare, a particular series of challenges that have emerged in the last week or so. And I wanted to call this podcast Old and New Supervision. You see, in my job, people around the world share their horror stories with me on Facebook, via email, via Twitter, via LinkedIn. And this week has been a real shocker. Students haven't seen their supervisors in 2 or 3 years and asked me how I can help. They simply can't get an appointment to see their supervisor. Their work hasn't been read. And supervisors are focusing on the articles where they can add their name to the publication rather than actually getting the thesis through to completion. So I've come home and I've talked about a lot of these horror stories with Steve, sort of as a way to share the horror, to debrief, but also just wondering why it's happening now and how this could be transformed around the world. And what's been interesting as I've come home with some horror and concern is Steve's response, as always, has been really calm and really relaxed and really rational. So I thought I'd share some of that calmness with you this week. So Steve, let's start with the obvious and difficult question. By the way, good morning, Stephen.
Good morning.
So Steve, why do supervisors neglect students?
I think at PhD level, the question is different. It's that in many ways, PhD supervision, certainly in the last few decades, has been seen as something else altogether, not supervision. So even though there are people who just can't be bothered, I think it's also to do with the way that the PhD has been seen.
Yes.
And regulated, so that PhD supervision for a lot of people, for a lot of academics, isn't supervision in the normal way. And even universities themselves actually use people who are not necessarily on salary to do supervision.
So whereas unpaid work.
Yes, unpaid labour. And they wouldn't do that with either undergraduate teaching or even taught masters. So I think the idea of PhD as a research degree is actually seen differently, and I think that's part of the problem. And certainly that style of supervision, which is like non-supervision, you just don't see your student,
yes,
is quite historical. People, certainly in decades past, regularly did not see their student. They might see them at the beginning of the semester, and then 3 years later see how they're going.
See, now, where has that come from, Steve?
I think it was the way that people supervised in many ways, because people saw PhD as something different. And in many ways, when there were fewer PhD students and it really was an elite qualification, the idea that you didn't have to see your supervisor was actually quite a benefit for the student. If the student could do the work, they were sent away to do the work for 3 years, and then they saw their supervisor at graduation.
And Steve, of course, you've had some personal experience with this, because
I have.
Your master's degree, your research master's, your LLM, was supervised in that way, like go away, do something and come back, and of course that had problems, but your PhD was properly supervised. Do you want to talk about the difference?
Yes, the Masters by Research, which is a classic example of this. I didn't see my supervisor, and there was only one of them, for basically a year, and it was only a 12-month thing.
Oh.
And at the end of that supervisory period, I remember going to stand outside his office and wait for a meeting, and I thought he had read all of my 52,000 words as I was going along. I handed it in, and I thought I was being really conscientious. And the supervisor was actually talking to someone inside the office, and I overheard them say, something about the work that's just been handed in. And he was talking about the first chapter, which I'd handed in months before. Oh, wow. So that is a classic example, but he didn't see that as he was aping the supervision for PhD students, and probably his own PhD students. That's how it got reproduced. In my PhD case, my supervisor was completely different, and I saw him. He taught me actually at undergraduate level, and I had a completely different relationship. And that was the sort of supervision that I kind of reproduced myself later on. So I think you've got to see it almost as a tradition, that the non-supervision thing is part of a tradition of PhD supervision. I think the big difference is that things are now changing globally, so that there has been a lot more regulation of PhD supervision, but also that you've got many more PhD students with different kinds of needs and skills.
Yes.
And that's why you have to start to think about non-supervision as a problem.
And in fact, I'm writing a piece that might end up not only a vlog, but also I think a wider article today about the deficit model and the impact of the deficit model on the doctoral space. Yeah. And can I say for podcast listeners, and what I'm picking up is this non-supervision, which, to be frank with you, I'm calling incompetent supervision. I think you're being too kind. Yeah. It is probably the culture, because I was just thinking as you were speaking, and experiential ideologies are very dangerous in the doctoral space, as you and I had discussed. But I mean, my master's degree, one of my supervisors simply went on leave for the second half of it. He had a right to. He was a great human being, but didn't see him because he was on leave. And the other guy never turned up to a single meeting in 2 years. And no one read the final draft. I walked up to the bench in the administrative block and handed it in on my own without a signature, because none of the supervisors could be bothered signing it in. And then, of course, the infamous PhD story, where I was incredibly poor, living relatively rough in my first academic job in Wellington, no money at all, and I was sending back a chapter to my supervisor by post from Wellington to Perth. I didn't have the money to be doing this, and I did it. And then when I came to submit, thinking that he'd read those chapters that I'd sent methodically each time I'd finished it, he said, "Oh no, you have to send it to me all again before I'll sign it off." To which I went, #you're dreaming, girlfriend, or expletives to that effect, yeah? Now, so all I'm saying is perhaps, I mean, we've only got a sample size of 2, which is pointless, but I'm saying in all cases pretty well, it was incompetent supervision. So where has this culture come from? Because this is a culture of incompetence, isn't it? Or am I being too harsh?
I think there's both. I think there is a culture where people can't be bothered. But I also think the fact that this is seen as a different kind of relationship between student and staff, a different kind of qualification,
yes,
partly fueled by the idea that it is really an elite qualification. I think those factors are really important, but I also think what you've got is this globalisation of the PhD, and that now is having an effect. In the last 5 or 10 years, as you said, there is now a different demand. And students themselves are starting to take their power into hand, really. And I just think you can't do that old cultural non-supervision anymore.
I think that's a really great point. And can I say, where globalisation is incredibly useful for nations like Australia is it stops microclimates in particular institutions where very negative, very unhelpful cultures have emerged about supervision. And of course, particularly, because Australian cities are so isolated, you've got microclimates that emerge where people have stayed at the same institution for 20 years, they've never worked anywhere else, they've never done any professional development, they've examined very rarely, so what they've done in the past, they continue to perpetuate. And so globalisation kicks in good and hard, I think, to create a lifting of standards and an awareness that the world is changing,
and then a huge higher education research literature as well.
Absolutely, and it is amazing how few people, when they're supervising, actually have the andragogical expertise to read this literature. I mean, part of what I try and do at Flinders is always do it as an evidence-driven protocol.
Absolutely.
So what are the longitudinal studies telling us? What are the regulatory environments telling us in the UK, in Canada? Look at what's happening, interestingly, in the regulatory space in the African nations and seeing the impact of that in terms of thinking about the oral exam, the use of technology and supervision. We can learn from other places. Incredibly important. And that really leads to the next question about changing expectations, I think. because universities, I think, and the expectations of the outcomes derived from universities have changed radically in the last 5 years, 10 years, but also, I would argue, right now, if you're looking at what's happening in Australia, the outcomes we are going to have to generate now and going forward are going to change radically. So why do you think supervision, doctoral supervision, has lagged behind these other imperatives? So, for example, in undergraduate education, there's much greater attention to benchmarking, to the deployment of rubrics in assessment and so forth. So why has supervision been such an under-regulated space?
I think it's probably because it suited the participants. So
students and
staff, yeah, I think so, and also, you know, it was the last kind of bastion of that old style of non-supervision. So I think that happened for a long time, actually. So this area was almost ring-fenced from true regulation, if you like.
Yeah.
Now that's no longer possible.
No.
For the reasons we've given. And also, it really is a matter of students, as you say, sharing their horror stories on social media or whatever, and something having to be done about it. And I think people in universities, certainly in Australia, are actually catching up now, and it's a good thing.
It is, and I think things like international students, for example, where they are given a visa for a particular time, they're paying enormous fees. We must get those students through in 3 years.
Yeah,
we have a responsibility to do so. You know, their families are suffering to pay those fees. Yeah. So I'm not sure how supervisors sleep at night if they're not even allowing the student to see them, and their parents are suffering to pay those fees.
Yeah. No, the demands are now different, I think, internationally and nationally.
Yeah. So why do you think is there so much hostility to professional development in the doctoral space? There's ambivalence, there's hatred, there's laziness. It is that experiential ideology rather than an evidence-driven or an expertise-driven environment. And I think expertise, Steve, as we know post-Brexit and with Trump, expertise is almost a dirty word these days. It's like, leave me alone, I will supervise as I've always supervised, I don't need to learn anything. I've had 15 completions, I've had 20 completions. But actually, how many have you lost? How do we assess the failures here? And why is PD so difficult to implement in this space?
Yeah, I think you're right that it is a question of expertise, and what has happened, particularly with the sort of models that we've been talking about, is that the supervision itself has been defined individually, subjectively, and very often on the basis of the staff member's own experience, as you say. It's the experiential ideology that has become the problem.
Yeah.
But I think expertise in itself is, as you say, is under fire.
Yeah.
So what has to be done, I think, is to build up professional development, and the idea that everyone should be open to professional development in this area as they go along, however experienced they are. And good training, for good supervisors is absolutely essential.
Yeah. And also, I think, creating an open environment where colleagues can ask colleagues for information.
Absolutely, it should be collegial.
It's something that I've tried to do at Flinders, and I think it is working, because obviously my office is always open, and I get a lot of queries and commentary from supervisors around the world as much as students.
Yeah, very much so.
And I got a fascinating email that we might do as a podcast in a week or so about a colleague, a B level, that's a lecturer for my international colleagues, and she was asking me, this is my second PhD examination. It's a PhD by publication, and this looks really problematic to me.
Yeah.
This looks incredibly low in standard, and look, can I just talk through the examination process with you? Here are the regulations, and can we actually talk through this, because I think I'm about to fail this, and obviously failing a PhD is very serious. Can I talk about it with you? So that openness and that sort of just-in-time PD, I think, is also useful.
Very much so. It's an informal learning, and that's what you should be creating.
Yeah, but again, because it's all very atomised and isolated and competitive and really pretty dreadful a lot of the time, people don't admit weakness. And I think this is about learning. University is a place of learning for every single one of us. You've got to learn every day, read every day, think every day, create every day. And if you're not, you've really got to ask what you're doing in a university.
But also I think that university is a place of accreditation.
Yes.
And one thing about the PhD is that that's becoming more and more an important qualification, not just as an elite qualification, important qualification for people getting jobs.
Yes.
And as globally the labour markets are becoming more and more precarious,
Yes.
the actual standard of the PhD is actually under threat, under fire.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually the bigger context for the sort of issues we're talking about.
Yeah, and as we talked about, Steve, when you and I were talking about coming to Adelaide and me taking this job, the reason, I think we had a series of jobs we could have taken, the reason we decided, the two of us, to come here was because we were horrified and worried that the standard of the PhD was declining. And we just thought for a particular period of our lives we would stand for something and say the standard of the PhD matters. And that's what this job was about for me, is going, you know what, the buck stops here. If we lose the PhD, if we dumb down the doctorate, then we have nothing left in higher education. No. So I'm very proud of that decision that we've made. But in some ways I do remain horrified. And I think I've mentioned selfishness already in this podcast. I sort of remain horrified at the selfishness of supervision. And certainly there are fantastic supervisors, there are brilliant supervisors in Australia and beyond. But I always have that memory at one of my former universities in Australia, can I say, where a staff member spoke out in the corridor and a stack of people could hear her actually, where she said, I'm not even going to bother opening my student's chapter to read until she guarantees that my name will be added to all her publications. So I won't even do my job as a supervisor and read work until she guarantees that I'm going to be added as an author. So why does this type of selfishness exist in the supervisory space?
I think it is sometimes just that people can't be bothered, but I think it's increasingly about staff actually having PhD supervision as an add-on to their workload. And I think that's happening all around the world.
Good point.
There's a global problem of labour power in universities.
Yes.
And you're talking about people who are incredibly stressed and stretched.
Yes.
A lot of the time. And what's happening is that instead of the PhD supervision being the most important thing in the workload system, it's actually the least important.
Really?
And very often, as has happened for decades, people are being asked effectively to supervise for free. Right. And I think the fact that has happened and it is so embedded in systems means that you do get really extremes of sort of bad behaviour in supervision. But I think a lot of it is actually from that reproduction of labour power in universities. I really do.
Yeah, but I tell you what, isn't it damn tragic? Isn't it tragic that, and I agree with you, there's a hell of a lot that's going wrong in the labour force in higher education, and I'll be doing a lot of work on the precariat, and I've done a lot of work with Stanley Arnowitz on the knowledge factory and so forth, and I agree with all of that. But isn't it horrendous that instead of actually working through that exploitation in a different way, you do it by exploiting the weakest member of our intellectual community? Isn't that horrendous?
And in some ways the most important qualification.
Yeah, the most important qualification, the most important people we graduate are our PhD students. At every graduation, the graduation of those PhD students is the moment of the ceremony. I think we need to remember that.
We do.
That symbolic capacity all the way through the supervision. And last question, Steve, and this is about empowerment. I'm glad you went to labour power there. How can we empower students in their relationship with their supervisor? So what advice can we offer to the students listening to this, many who are in a really bad way, devastated, people I talk with on Skype or on the phone who phone me from all over the world, are often in tears within about 20 seconds of talking with me, really upset. So how are we going to empower students to try and mitigate and manage this going forward?
I think the best outcome is proper training systems for students and staff.
Yeah.
In which there are scenarios played out.
Yeah.
The extreme ones that you're talking about, but also the everyday ones. And I think that would be expected in undergraduate education, even taught master's education. But actually, it's not been expected in the past in PhD, and in some ways, it has been an unregulated space.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you get the extremes that you're talking about, but also you get the problems of the everyday.
Yeah.
And that is the way to properly empower, in my view, because otherwise you're always talking about atomised individuals who really can't get any sort of satisfaction. And in some cases, the students themselves are exploiting that. So I think the regulation of that PhD space is the way to go.
And can I just offer one counter to that? So I agree with you on regulation. Most people disagree with you.
They do.
Big hello to Claudia. Claudia and I have been arguing about
they
regulation.
disagree, for very good reasons.
Yes.
We're used to non-regulation of aspects of university life.
But can I also say, could a neoliberal market economy element come good here? So in other words, and this I am seeing this a little bit already, whereby a bad supervisor who has exploited students talk.
Yes.
Students talk and either exploit their students, long candidatures, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. If a supervisor is unable to get a student through, students talk.
Yes.
So students start to avoid those supervisors or those disciplines or those areas. So that's a non-regulation market economy way of handling that.
Yes, in theory that's okay, but there aren't enough supervisors.
Good point.
In many different areas, so I'm
so
not sure that always
there's no labour
works.
surplus.
I'm not sure that always works. Yeah.
But that's fascinating. But Steve, thank you for this conversation. And look, it is a tough space. It's a tough conversation. Because I just get sad. I used to get angry, but now I just sort of get sad because I always think it's such a privilege to supervise. I just think you wake up in the morning and go, isn't it a privilege to be working with the next generation of scholars who are transforming their lives individually, but also transforming their nation and their culture?
Yeah.
And the idea that that's being undermined or ridiculed or disrespected through selfish behaviour or indeed ignorance. It's either, I would argue, just being selfish or ignorant that you don't even know what you're doing. That it just devastates me, really.
And it's a joy to supervise at PhD level, it really is.
It is. There's so much of higher education that's well dodgy, but one of those areas that's not well dodgy, that's a joy, is the PhD supervision.